This is the I4.0 Integration Suite with part 15, connecting to an SQL database and read and write using SQL queries. Imagine we have a database called test containing two tables with the name variables and trends. On the other side, we have a SCADA server with an internal namespace and a Spider PLC, and we would like to have a functional block which is able to read and write to this database. To do so, we would like to have functionality which copies the values of the row name and value to an internal namespace called something like itsel's OTF my array 0 name, value, 1 name, 1 value, etc. And the same thing for trends, where this function should copy all the rows to an internal namespace too. To support this, we have two functional blocks. One is to read from the SQL database by just sending a SQL query, like for instance select star from variables and give the structure name where the result should be copied to as an operator. And the other functional block to write to a variable, you just send an SQL query to the database which contains the variable name and the value which should be copied to the database. So let's look at the real example. Okay, so let's continue. We'll open the sheet containing the SQL code. What we have here is two functional blocks to read and write to the database. These functional blocks can be found here in this section, so we have several blocks to connect to a SQL server by Microsoft or to my SQL database, which is used here. The configuration of these functional blocks is as follows. So the first parameter is the host name. So this SQL database is located on the same computer, so we have a local host. Otherwise you could use an IP address or just a referral to another network member. We have the name of our database, which is test, as we've seen before. We have the username to access the database, which is root in this case, and the possible password for correspondence with root, and we have no password use on this database, so it will work just fine. The configuration for the write DB is exactly the same, so we have just the basic database identifications here. The first parameter for this DB functional block is the query string, which we'll just send in from an internal variable of the Spider PLC. The second parameter is this return array name, the root name basically, so I've noted all these things again here. So this is the parameter which we give here, and so the return value of this functional block will just add all the results subsequently to this root name. So this could be anything. This could point to some PLC variables, or here we have internal automatic variables which will just be created when first time used. We furthermore have an array offset, so the result could begin with something different than 0, so this logic will just add this offset, and we have the trigger to execute the query. Over here we have these variables just for the purpose of debugging. We have a display of these variables, so this is the first array, the name, and this is the value, and the second response variable, and this third, etc. And the same thing for the trend table. Same thing here, so the first date and values of a couple of samples. And with these buttons we can just write some predefined scripts, SQL statements, SQL queries to this input string. So we'll exit the programming, make a build and run, and start the debugger, and we'll have a look at the real thing. So here we are. When I press here, this will just, as said before, write this SQL query, and we can now execute that. So we will now, from the variables table, read out all what is in there, and as soon as we trigger, we will find that the names will be filled in and the current variables. We can do the same for the write function. So we have a function which will set the value to 0 for the variable PPODB1. So that will be the first one. We will trigger that, and we will trigger the read function again, and we see that we have a 0 here. So we will do the same thing for the other two, or we write 1 and 2 for the 2 and 3 for 3, and read it again. And so this shows how we can read and write to the database. And we will make a read from the table trends, so we'll execute that, and we see that it reads the timestamps and the values which were stored there. So thanks for watching.